Thank you for listening to Living Our Best with Memory Loss.
Hi, I'm Bob Stryer, one of your podcast hosts. I do have mild cognitive impairment, MCI, and it was brought on by a stroke.
I'm Sue Ann Cobb. I'm one of your hosts. I have mild cognitive impairment due to having MS.
And I'm Dennis Lowe, also a producer of this podcast, and I have a diagnosis of young onset, early stage Alzheimer's disease.
I'm David Bollinger. They call me Debo. I run the equipment here so you can see and hear these guys. Welcome to our podcast, Living Our Best with Memory Loss.
The purpose of this podcast is for people to share their experiences with cognitive decline. It is not to provide medical advice. We are not doctors, and we stress that what might have worked for one person might not work for others. If anything you hear on this program inspires you to explore treatment options, we recommend you do so in consultation with your physician.
Welcome to another edition of our podcast, Living Our Best with Memory Loss. Today we have a great guest and a great friend of mine joining us, and her name is Dr. Nicole Perez. Dr. Perez, Nicole, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Perez, I just want to explain to our viewers and listeners what got us here today. Nicole and I were having coffee one day, and I'd written some notes down over something that I had read. And I said to Dr. Perez, I read that people with less education will have a higher prevalence of cognitive decline. And then I'd also written that people with higher education will have a faster progression if they get a diagnosis of memory loss. And when I presented that to her, she was like, okay, this calls for a podcast. This calls for a much bigger conversation. And then that is why Dr. Perez is here today.
Thank you. So what science will say about IQ and cognitive problems are not related. You can have a very high IQ, a very low IQ, it doesn't matter. In terms of education and intellectual, how much you develop your intellectual capacity, right? Because for most people, we all kind of have the same intellectual capacity, unless you have a developmental problem, right? You work with children and you've seen that, right? The more we develop our intellectual capacity, so there's not a direct relationship between how educated you are and how a cognitive disorder will manifest. But it's more noticeable for a person who has developed their brain in many areas versus the person who has not, right? So the science is really interesting because the science will say the findings, the research, and, research in itself is mostly we have these big reviews that we got to glump a bunch of people together and we got to we do these big reviews of a lot of studies. So we take a lot of studies together and then we kind of try to discern what the information is trying to say. So this is not a perfect science, especially in this area, because not everybody's different, right? But it will say that people with less education will have a higher prevalence of cognitive decline. Okay. And they say that people with higher education will have a more rapid progression if they get any kind of cognitive problem. The way that I look at it as someone interpreting the science that, like I said, is not, we're combining a bunch of studies together, so it's not very clear. So the way that I interpret it is okay, so I think that the more educated person has more to lose faster than the less educated person. So that means it'll be more noticeable in someone that is less educated because there's not, the it just becomes more basic faster. Whereas with the cognitive reserve, the progression for you, that doesn't mean that you have less or more chances of getting a cognitive problem. It just means that the progression for you is more noticeable.
Does it correlate with the more you use your brain? Like when we met for coffee that day and I said, we only use 10%. And you said, no, you actually use your entire brain. And so does it correlate with that the more exposed you are to travel, to science, to education? Okay.
Yes. The capacity of the brain to fire at all cylinders, obviously, comes with exposure to the environment that demands from the brain to fire at all cylinders. So the brain, you get the brain develops, and it just keeps developing depending on what you expose it to.
Well, I think something that you can understand there, after I retired, I figured I had to do something else. I couldn't just lay around the house. And so Debo and I started a hemp farm. I've never farmed in my entire life. But here I am at 78 or 79 of doing something totally different than I've ever done in my life. And it worked out pretty well because we both learned quite a bit from what we did. We went out and got the information we needed to grow. And we did that for 3-4 years. So I can see that the brain will continue on if you're doing something interesting that you want to do. And I don't know if that makes sense, but it was something that I've never done before, but yet I had to learn it.
Well, I think what you're saying, Bob, and Dr. Perez, you tell us that it's important, even though we might not have a capacity anymore, somebody with a diagnosis, they should keep challenging their brain. They should keep reading, as Dennis read 37 books from January or February of this year. It's only been a few months. 46 books. So I guess, and what Bob
I haven't read that many my whole life, Dennis.
That's impressive.
As of last night.
That is actually impressive.
But so I guess, and what you're asking, Bob, it's important that you at least keep working or challenging yourself, emotionally and intellectually. Does that help, Dr. Perez? Somebody that does have, just to bring it around for viewers and listeners, if you are diagnosed, the importance of continuing to try to develop your brain, to educate yourself. What would you suggest?
Yes, of course. If you don't use a muscle, you lose it. If you don't practice another language, you will forget it. If you don't, that is just a basic notion of, try to keep what you have in your cognitive reserve, the way, and also I think that what's important for people, and as clinicians, we don't do a really good job, and I, no offense to, any of my colleagues, MDs, neurologists, psychologists or otherwise, I don't mean to, be offensive about it, but, we're so careful about not explaining to people with cognitive problems. We're just so careful. I don't know what it is, if it's an anxiety of being offensive or not diminishing or, not eliciting. Maybe it makes us, uncomfortable. I'm not sure what it is. But, one of the things about the brain is if I can tell you where your brain problem is and I can tell you where it's not, then those are still parts of the computer that are available for your use. So you may do very well learning like something manual, right? But maybe not good at writing vocabulary anymore, right? Or you may be very good at like farming something and learning that, but you may not be able to teach anymore. So I think I think that what I try to do with my patients when we're dealing with a cognitive problem is, okay, forget about what doesn't work. You have parts of your brain that still work. I mean, this is not, the entire brain is not fully affected. It may feel that way, but you still have parts of your brain that clearly work. Let's talk about what still works.
I love that. Yeah.
And that's an optimistic way of dealing with this situation as well, which, at another time we can talk about the emotional aspect of this, but you bank on the information that you have, on the cognitive reserve that you have, and on the skill set that you still can do. And that's a very promising way of doing this.
Is there such a thing as cognitive reserve, and what is it?
Well, okay, so cognitive reserve would be, let me start backwards. Let me start by smarts. Okay. So when I was thinking for a title for this particular episode of your podcast, I was thinking, what do I call what we're trying to address when we think about intelligence and education? And so I decided to go with smarts, like apostrophe, So IQ is, a person can have a very high IQ, very low education. You can have a very high education. That doesn't mean that you have an extraordinary IQ. You may just be very good at memorizing stuff, or I always say that intellect, being intellectual, being educated, and just being IQ smart, they're different things. We all know that, right? So cognitive reserve is a combination perhaps of all of it. If you have a lot of it in all of those areas, then you have more resources to pull from when parts of your brain start to fail. So, how these things manifest in terms of what we lose, what we're aware of, it has a lot to do with what we have in our brain to begin with. So that's what cognitive reserve is all about.
And then is it true that the older we get, the more IQ points we lose? Is that a fair?
That is a normal progression of the brain. So I think the statistic is we drop about 10 IQ points. And that's normal cognitive
but
aging.
it's not dramatic.
But it's not dramatic. It's not.
That's normal. That's not a diagnosis.
No, that's not a diagnosis. This is outside of that. And if you really think about a cognitive disorder, again, this is why IQ and intellect and, education, we have to make those distinctions, because IQ in itself is just kind of my ability to learn. Well, as you age, you drop 10 points. Is it really a problem? This is why we kind of stay out of new technology and whatever. We just kind of go like, well, I don't need to use it anymore, and I don't want to. And, I don't. So, but when it comes to an actual problem, that's beyond what we just don't need to learn anymore.
My deterioration in a nutshell is I don't learn things anymore. I can't absorb new information and process it. So there's really not much growth in new areas, because the ability to retain or to absorb that information is gone.
That's right.
So you keep losing 10 points as you age? Every year that you age, you keep losing?
No, that's total.
Just over the lifetime.
Yeah.
That's not too bad.
No, exactly. And that's exactly the point. I mean,
love it.
if you only drop 10 points, we're good to go,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, if you're starting at one,
It's like,
if you're starting at 170, you
Yeah,
know, so
I
what's
mean, if
10
you-
points?
yeah, I
if
mean,
you're starting at 90,
who cares, right?
if you're
Yeah,
starting
but
at
if
90,
you're starting at 90, then you have a developmental disorder, right? So you didn't have the capacity to begin with. So, but if you're in that normal range, 10 points they really do not matter over the lifetime.
Well, that's good because I'm 83 now, and I'm thinking, God, by the time I'm 85, I'm not going to have anything left.
That's right.
I'm glad she clarified that for you, Bob. Yeah, speaking of that, we need your car keys.
I mean, but the idea of not being able to take in new information, what I do find in my practice with high functioning individuals, again, that's what I specialize on, which is, people who have professional careers, business owners, doctors, lawyers, you know. So, I think that their level of awareness is what's really distressing. So you were talking about initially this notion that my computer, which has been my work tool and what I've been the most proud of in my life, because I think that people who are highly educated, they're going like I am what I do in many ways. So when you become aware that your computer is getting glitchy and you can't replace it and you got to start folding your cards, it feels shameful because it's who you are.
I really struggled with that a lot. I'm better about it, but it kind of depends on when I've messed up and what I messed up. But it really took me by surprise that not only am I dealing with, this issue of my memory, but now I'm also having to deal with how I feel about it and how it's impacting me and my self-esteem. So I don't imagine I'm unique in that, but
What I love is when Bob said, I'm going to grow hemp with Devo. And then with that venture, and they did very well, by the way, then when that venture, well, it didn't really end because then they went on to making gummies, CBD, right? CBD,
right.
just to be clear. And so friends were
All
like...
legal, by the way.
All legal, just to be clear.
Completely legal.
Not everything.
But
It was.
had an undisclosed location.
Where's my cell phone? I know I have a lawyer,
Yeah,
like
we had it
a
all.
retainer or something,
I never said that.
I don't remember saying that.
This is a good group to talk about it.
Yeah.
But it excited me because I was proud of him because at least he was doing something.
Yeah.
And he was using and
He's
he was
interested.
learning and he was
He's
interested
excited
in
about it,
something.
yeah.
And I think that I would advise anybody or anybody with a diagnosis, whether it be the caregiver or the patient, I just think it's important to, and I guess you would agree, to just keep using your head as much as possible.
Yeah, just in anything that happens to the brain, you have to understand, just really think about it as this computer system. Just use that part that still works. Just keep using that part that still works. Recognize what works, use that part that still works, and that part is it's, if you can't use your legs anymore, then start using your arms. If you can't use, it's just, if you can't run anymore, then swim. If you can't, it's a matter of maybe the idea is, just going with living our best with memory loss. Maybe the idea is to learn to neurologically pivot.
I like that. I love that term.
Well, here again, we all decided to do this podcast, and we all have problems, but we're doing the podcast.
That's right.
I love that.
So you're talking about it. Dennis is talking about it.
Haltingly.
We're all talking about it. Well, most of the time, and we're all talking about these things. So it's something that we're
is.
doing that's good.
It's a
Oh,
new
and the
project.
feds are outside right now. Hey, is that what I'm hearing? Are we getting raided because of your endeavors? Yeah, I mean, I think let's pivot. Think about it that way. Just neurologically, we pivot. If one command doesn't work, try a different command. If one software doesn't work, try a different software. If one cable doesn't work, try to hook it up to another, receptacle and see if you can get current from that side. So I think pivoting, don't underestimate what the brain can do.
Well, and I like what you said, using the part of your brain that's working, and that makes me think of a lot of like my grandfather and my aunt who's currently doing this stuff. Once you get diagnosed and once you know things are kind of falling apart and you can't live on your own, I think you just start to, you give up somewhat. A lot of people do. And suddenly everyone's taking care of you. And thinking of it that way, I need to sit down and kind of, my aunt was a psychiatrist, right? So she would always pick my brain. I need to sit down and just pick her brain and just see where her strong suits are. And she used to read a ton. She doesn't read anymore, but she was very crafty and she would make things. So I need to figure that out. And
So you can help her pivot?
Because it'll atrophy. If she doesn't use the part that's still working,
well,
it will make
the
her
brain
decline
will
quicker.
prune it. The brain will go no longer needed, so it'll prune it out. It's like it'll just get rid of it. I love cartoons for whatever reason because I'm a weirdo. There you go. See, creepy. So the movie Inside Out 2 is out, and I have not seen it yet, so no spoilers. But when Inside Out came out the first time, for those of you who have seen it, or for those of you that haven't seen it, please, just watch it, because it has such a beautiful way of explaining the pruning of the brain and the information that gets lost. And it has this big dark precipice of information that is no longer useful, like forgetting the little elephant that she used to have when she was a child, and these memories and these things that just go into that precipice, and once it's in that precipice, it's just gone forever. It's lost. You're moving the marbles, then it's lost. I mean, it's such a beautiful, simplified but complex interpretation of how the brain works. So if you don't use it and you put it to the side and you don't exercise it long enough, the brain will just make room for new information, which is the problem right here, because we got to keep the ones that we have. We can't get new information, but it will just get rid of it. And that's what we call cognitive economy.
Well, then what would make it that if you're going along and all of a sudden you haven't thought of a particular instant that you did like 25 years ago, and it comes back and everything that went on with that. So how are you being able to bring that back if it was gone to start with?
So we have a difference between long-term memories and short-term memories. They live in different parts of the brain. They're deeper in our brain. Those synaptic connections get kind of grandfathered in. So think about having controlled rent in New York City. There's just a sense of it somewhere in your mind, your brain decided that was important information to retain. How the brain decides that, I have no idea. But the brain will say, that was meaningful enough. I'm going to put it in this file not to be forgotten. Maybe because it was so useful at some point in time. Maybe it's because it's entangled with an experience that is protective. Maybe, I don't know the reason, but it has a reason. And that's why sometimes we will smell something and we'll remember everything about it, or we'll be walking and see something, and then all of a sudden we remember, the first time we recall going to the mall with mom, or, some stuff like that. So my guess is that we retain those because they the brain decides that that has a particular meaning that is broader than just that memory.
Dr. Perez, this has been phenomenal. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh,
Yeah.
we have loved it. And what you're not aware of is that you're going to be a reoccurring guest on our podcast. So I'm not even
I
asking.
enjoyed this conversation a lot. It's like,
We loved it. We loved it. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
you're welcome.
And wow, and everybody tune in because she will be back again. Unbeknownst to her, Dr. Perez will be a reoccurring guest on our podcast.
unless I forget.
Unless she forgot, we'll come.
That'd
we'll,
be great.
We'll drag you out of your office. Thank you for joining us, everybody. And next week we'll be back with another podcast, Living Our Best with Memory Loss.